Morning, everybody. You can do better. Good morning, everybody. It's wonderful to be here. So many faces that I recognize, lots of precious people in the room. And so I can't wait to share the Word of God with you this morning and to give you some stories on what I've witnessed, what I've seen. I am Sam Ward. I'm from the Message Trust. I've worked there now for a decade through different roles across that time. The Message Trust is now 30 years old, actually, 30 years this year. Started by an evangelist called Andy Hawthorne, who started a band called the Worldwide Message Tribe. Anybody heard it? Yes. They came into our school when I think I was about 15 at the time. And wow, that was quite a thing. He would say himself that they were absolutely awful. I would agree. But they saw amazing things happen. You know, they were so focused on the schools of Manchester throughout the week, and then at the weekends they would be all over the world kind of preaching the gospel at big events and stuff. And they actually went on to sell hundreds of thousands of records, bizarrely. And I still meet people all over the planet that once heard the Worldwide Message Tribe. And actually the legacy lives on. We continue to do creative mission in different ways. On Friday, we were doing a gig up in Middleton where 49 kids responded to the gospel, which was pretty epic. It's not just creative mission that the Message do. We also do something called Eden, where we move teams of like urban missionaries into areas of deprivation. And that's been my heart and my passion now for some years. It started because the Worldwide Message Tribe went into a school in Wythenshawe, at the time the #1 most deprived community in the country, did a schools week where 100 kids came to Christ, and then they tried to put them into local churches, and the church just weren't ready for them. I'm told, 60 to 80 kids turned up with their dogs and their skateboards, tore the place apart, and weren't content with the colouring in sheets they were given, and so they had to find a solution, an alternative. And the idea was that we'd move in young radical Christians that would disciple them along their journey of faith. And so Eden was born, and that has grown and developed over the last 25 years with now 70 teams that have been planted. And actually now some internationally. I've got a team in Germany, one just starting in the Netherlands. We've got some in South Africa and in Canada. 700 people have made the decision to relocate from an area of affluence into an area of poverty. More of that to come. We've got these mobile youth centres that we call message buses, double-decker buses that are probably the coolest thing going. They really are. And I'm not cool, but I think they're pretty ace. They're really good. And we continue to work in prisons too. Working in young offenders institutions and in prisons now up and down the country. I was sharing earlier about a lad who came to work with us this week. He's been in prison since he was a juvenile, sentenced to 20 years in prison, saved by one of our workers, discipled through his final years in prison. This week he started working for us. He's been given a house and a church family, and will be given the opportunity to really grow in his faith. It's a beautiful thing. And I suppose there's lots of these sort of social enterprises around the Message that are enabling people to find jobs and continue their kind of rehabilitation. And then we've got these things called community groceries. I don't know if you've seen the community grocery network. It's so cool. It's one of the things I'm most passionate about at the moment. During COVID lockdown, I got really concerned about hungry kids that might have been able to access free school meals while schools were open, that suddenly would be at great risk if the schools were to shut. And so I came up with this thing called the Lockdown Hunger Project. How could I get churches and schools to partner together to feed the most vulnerable kids in society? And actually we did incredibly well. We saw this network of churches take on the responsibility of hungry kids. 5 million meals were distributed in that first lockdown period. And we were distributing food all over the place ourselves through the Message Trust. And I felt, as we came out of COVID, did I want to continue to give bags of food out to people? Or did I want to think more strategically, more holistically about how we addressed the issues of poverty? And so I began to think about a more dignified approach where people could come to shops that were open pretty much 9 to 5, choose the food that their families wanted to eat and that they knew how to cook, and then begin to see people journey out of poverty, because we added all this wraparound care when the church begins to teach and to train and to serve the most vulnerable, that lives are changed. And it's brilliant. Today, today in Wythenshawe, where we planted our first community grocery, a church will meet of around 200 to 250 people, 90% of whom are people who've been won for Jesus because they came to a community grocery to get food and help, and are now following Christ. It's a brilliant, brilliant thing. I'm going to be at the back at the end. If you'd like to talk to me about the work of the message, we want to hear some more stories, please do sign up to our mailing list. If you are stirred by what you hear and think, I'd love to back you financially, please come and see me. I'll give you a resource pack. You can get loads of goodies, and I'd be most grateful. Of all the things that the message do, the thing that has, I suppose, captivated me the most has been Eden, this movement of urban missionaries who have encountered God and want to use their life for the service of the poor. As I gave my life to Jesus, really committed myself to following him in my late teens, I felt this stirring in my heart, particularly towards the poorest of the poor. And I thought I was therefore going to go and be a missionary somewhere. I was convinced that the Lord would send me to India or Estonia, and I began to look at sort of missionary sending organizations. How did I get myself ready to be sent out? If I knew the blessing of God in my life, how did I become a blessing to other people? What would that look like? And then I felt, as I prayed, the Lord say, if you can't cross the street, don't cross an ocean. If you can't cross the street to share the good news of Jesus, if you don't have the courage to even tell your friends and your neighbors, don't start thinking about people on the other side of the world. So I committed myself to local mission. What did that look like? And so I began to serve a homeless charity. On a Friday night, I'd go and make sandwiches and soup, and then go out and serve those who lived on the street and those who worked the streets with this kind of package of food on a Friday night. And I remember returning from the city centre out to the suburbs and feeling like God say to me, it's good, but it's not what I asked of you. I asked you to give the best of yourself. I asked you to lay your life down in service of the kingdom. What would that look like? And so I'd heard about these guys who were radically choosing the poor and relocating into areas of deprivation. And when I heard about the vision of Eden, I was like, this is me. And so I moved in to a place called Openshaw in East Manchester, where I have lived ever since. I'm 23 years now in the same community. A community that you can imagine is blighted by all kinds of issues. It was number 22 on the indices of deprivation. Out of 32,000 different neighborhoods, it was right up there in one of the worst places. The police told us it had no-go zone areas for the police. There was lots and lots of boarded up houses. If you want to get a glimpse of what it looks like, go onto YouTube and type in The Forgotten People of Openshaw, because there was a Granada TV kind of series that was part of the news about my neighborhood from 1996. It's absolutely incredible. Really, really very, very broken. High levels of crime, very, very poor education, very poor healthcare, and that was the place I felt God say move to. I move in into like a 2-up, 2-down terrace next to this guy called Tommy, who was an alcoholic, crazy guy, still known to this day, still lives in the community with me. And next door on the other side was a lady called Karen. Karen lived with her mum and her daughter, and they were all sex workers, working from home. And that was crazy, right? Because you'd be invited round to Karen's house for a cup of tea, and then you'd have to leave pretty sharpish when it was business time, and you have to come home. And man, there was some things we experienced along the way. I moved in with a guy I'd never met before. My dad turned up with all my belongings in his kind of red Montego, and emptied everything out into the household, with everybody sort of watching what kind of belongings I had as we sort of brought them in from the car. It was a real experience. That night, as I went to bed, hearing the police helicopter going around the community, and this guy joyriding through the estate and getting wedged in the alleyway between the houses and the wheeler bins. It was one heck of a journey. And I've seen massive transformation over that time, but also some deeply sad things along the way, some very, very hard things. We were convinced we would see revival really early on because we were so radical in our faith, so convinced of the gospel, that if we just got out there and shared it, everybody would come to know Jesus. We'd fill the church, plant churches, and then save the whole neighborhood, and that would be fixed. And it didn't really work out like that way. It was actually very, very difficult and painful. But we put on loads of great stuff. Every night I'd be out in the local park talking to young people. I put on youth clubs and kids clubs and mums and tots and various different clubs of all kinds. I did a club on a Saturday called Saturday Club because it was a club on a Saturday for lads who had no dads. When I just moved into the estate, 2 boys who lived just over the road, their dad had hung himself just a week before I arrived, and they became my boys. Even to this day, in their mid-30s, they're my boys. They're the people that God gave me as my sons. Very, very grateful to the people that he put in my life. We were almost like on mission 24/7. And actually what we realized was it wasn't the events that we put on, the projects that we ran and the clubs that we serviced them with. Our most effective mission was the fact that we lived on the same streets as those that we've gone to serve. When we locked up our youth club at the end of the night and walked home, I lived next to the young people that I was serving. And therefore we were on a sort of mission all the time. Round the clock at times. Sometimes people would knock on the door through the night. I remember one particular instance, getting a phone call at about 11 o'clock from a guy saying, "I've got to be baptized." And I said, "Well, we've got a proper baptism class for that, and there's a time." "No, I can't go to sleep until I've been baptized." And I said, "Where do we even get a baptism at this time of night, a baptistry?" And he was like, "Let's go to the canal." So, walking with him and trying to gather a few Christians on the way, and my brother came with a guitar, and we sort of sat on the side of the canal, singing a few songs before, went knee deep into muck in the Ashton Canal, trying to baptize him. It was brilliant though, because this guy walks past with his dog, and I'm full of the joy of the Lord because of what's happening, and I sort of shout out to him and I say, "Mate, we're baptizing this guy," and he was like, "If you're on drugs, the police are literally just round the corner." I'm like, "We're not on drugs. I'm just overjoyed because Jesus has saved this guy." He's like, "No, but if you are on drugs, the police are just round the corner." But it was brilliant. It was awesome. And I've totally lost what I'm saying. What I'm saying is our life was most effective because we were rooted within people's lives. What we were doing was so intrinsically linked and relational in our approach. Nothing we did was almost escaped from the eyes and the views of our neighborhoods. I remember, we're living in these really tight, narrow, terrace streets in a 2-up, 2-down houses. And so therefore everything that we did and said was very, very visible. The walls were so thin. I remember being told off by my neighbor once because I weed too loudly. My toilet and her bed were actually only inches apart, separated by a very thin wall. When someone knocks on your door in the morning just to say, "Do you mind having a sit-down wee because you pee too loud?" What on earth is going on? And therefore everything we did was visible to everybody around us. One particular night, I was awoken by banging outside of the house. I used to have this 2-bang rule. 1 bang, I was like, that's fine. 2 bangs, there's a problem. And so 2 bangs would get me to the window. And I climbed up on the windowsill and looked out and saw that there was 2 lads in my car. They didn't have permission to be in my car. They'd broken in. They'd sort of pulled back the door and reached in, and they were trying to hotwire it or whatever you do. And so I was fuming, obviously. So I started shouting out the window. I'm like, "Lads, what are you doing? Get out of my car!" And that just triggered everybody, on the street. Suddenly, all the lights are coming on. And to my surprise, as I sort of said, "I know who you are. You're in my youth club. I'm going to talk to your mum. I know she lives on number 36. And like this. And to my surprise, they got out and scarpered up the street. And then, you're just aware of everybody looking like, what did I say? Did I say something nice? Did I swear? And then at that point stood in the window that I realized I'm completely naked. I like stood in the windowsill like Gollum, like it was the most, and so our lives were exposed sometimes a bit too much to our community. We were trying to do the mission of God, trying to be good news to our neighborhood, but I was aware that everything that we did and said was on show. A little bit too much on show. My neighbor at one point was a guy called Otis from Jamaica, Rastafarian guy. He loved two things, Bob Marley and marijuana. And he would like them in a lot at the same time. And he had a problem because he would smoke so much that he would fall asleep, but he'd fall asleep with music on repeat. And so I met one particular Saturday night, having listened to Buffalo Soldier 20 times, going round and round and round, beginning to bang on his wall, Otis, wake up, Otis. I'm preaching in the morning on forgiveness. Ah. And so my words and my actions needed to line up. I became very aware about what I was communicating. And often we were communicating not just with our words as we shared the good news of Jesus, but our lives were communicating something else. If we weren't careful, they were out of line. And the call this morning is to make sure our lives are aligned with the gospel that we believe. We became very conscious of what we bought and where we bought it from. I had one person on my team that had this little liking for Waitrose. You know what I mean? When she turned up to the community with her shopping bags, lovely Waitrose bags, it made a statement about the kind of, no offense, it's okay to shop at Lidl. What I'm saying is, in my community, if you didn't shop at Lidl, there was, anyway, move on. We were aware of how we shopped. We were aware of what we ate. We were aware of what we wore. I remember bringing some lads to know Jesus at one point, and we had this amazing time away in Wales, and we sort of taught them through the gospel. And on the last night, it was a big response time. And I said, lads, we're just going to bow our heads, just going to allow the Lord. And if you want to respond in the gospel, or respond to the gospel, stand to your feet. And this lad going, whoa, whoa, whoa. And I was like, no, just bow your heads. And he's like, no, no, no. And he kept stopping me every time I started. And I was like, Lord, just get rid of that. And he was like, what I'm trying to say is, I've got some questions. And that's a good thing. He said, do I have to dress like you if I become a Christian? And I'm like, well, no, of course. And then, but I'd realized that even my clothes were a stumbling block to the gospel, as you can see. But how we responded to challenge and to hardship, how we suffered was important. How people witnessed the way that we lived, how we celebrated. I believe that Christians should be the best party animals on the planet. But how we party is important. How we forgave, how we rested, how we loved were all evident to my community. And if my voice out there was trying to be good news, did my life reflect it? What are we communicating? And this is what Paul is trying to draw our attention to. In our passage today from 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, Paul is trying to encourage us that our gospel message and our life must be aligned together. They cannot be separate. They cannot be dualistic in approach. He says this, brothers and sisters, that our visit to you was not without results. We previously suffered and been treated outrageously in Philippi, as you know. But with the help of our God, we dared to tell you the gospel in the face of strong opposition. For our appeal does not spring from error or impure motive, nor were we trying to trick you. On the contrary, we speak as those approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel. We're not trying to please people, but God who tests our heart. We never used flattery, nor do we put on a mask to cover up greed. God is our witness. We are not looking for praise from people, nor from you or anyone else. Even though as apostles of Christ we could have asserted our authority, instead we were like young children amongst you. Just as nursing mothers care for children, so we cared for you because we loved you so much. We were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, our lives as well. Surely you remember, brothers and sisters, our toil and hardship. We worked night and day in order to not be a burden to anyone while we preached the gospel of God. Paul tells them that his ministry has not been without results. How do we know it's not been without results? Well, he's writing to a church that he planted. And he'd invested, scholars tell me, about 18 months of his time. And he hadn't separated himself from the community. He hadn't set himself high and lofty away from them. He'd rooted himself in relationships so people could be exposed to his life. They'd seen great success despite real difficulty and hardship. I can testify that. We used to go to the park and kids would sort of see us shout, "God Squad," and then you'd see like this rain of fireworks come like landing. Pew! Anyway, not quite Paul's experience, let's say that. Paul puts his success down to the fact, though, that he didn't just share the gospel, but he shared his life. And that's what we're getting at this morning. In our gospel presentation, in our mission, we've not just got to be people who go out there on the street with signs that say, "Turn or burn." Actually, we've got to expose people to our lives, and our lives have got to be aligned with the gospel that we share. He says, "My gospel did not come to you in error." He needs them to know that he not only spoke truth, but lived truth. His gospel was not impure. He didn't lead a weird life. There was no kind of conspiracy about whether he was sleeping with anybody or doing the wrong kind of things. He kept himself on track. And there was no deceit in what he said. He didn't speak lies. He didn't speak one thing and then live another thing. No deceit within him. He was so careful that his words didn't flatter. He could have gone to places and told people how good they were and how unsinful they were and try and teach the wrong gospel, but yet he chose not to flatter anybody. And he mentions this idea of a mask. There was no mask, Paul says. I didn't hide greed behind anything else. My life that you saw represented was the life I need you to see. There's nothing hidden. And he could have handled the gospel heavy-handed because he had the authority of God, but yet he says, "I came to you like a young child, gentle and caring like a nursing mother." That was his approach to ministry. It wasn't just to go in and start sledgehammering people with the gospel, but he went with care and concern to those he was ministering to. His life and his words were aligned. People saw the integrity with which he lived. And I suppose the encouragement to you today is, how do you ensure that people see who you really are? You know, as we go out to be a blessing to the world, as we recognize the blessing that God has been to us, as we go out in the mission of God, are we going to allow people to see beyond the veneer, to get in and see who we really are? And that's why we've kind of chosen to invest in relationships, to have genuine friendships, not just friendships for the sake of seeing people won for Jesus, but friendships so that people know and understand our hearts. And so that I'm just aware that God has blessed me with so many incredible relationships along the way. And I've learned the value of not just giving, but also receiving and opening my life up. Not just to share the best bits, but sometimes the broken bits. I worked for years with a guy who was an addict, 40 plus years, a heroin addict. And I used to have to regularly take him to sort of drug appointments and to see various doctors and all sorts of stuff, to pick up his medication. And one time when I picked him up and he got in my car and we began to journey together, he said, "Sam, something's wrong. You're not your usual bubbly self, or something's not quite right. Tell me what's going on." Then in that moment, I could choose, couldn't I? I can put on the veneer, the mask, and pretend everything's fine, or I can let him in to what I'm feeling. At that time, my wife and I was struggling to conceive a child. We'd been through months and months of infertility, and the journey felt like it was coming to an end, and I was just broken, coming to terms with the fact that I would never have a child that I would call my own. And I decided in that moment I was going to tell him. And in that moment, something began to change. He began to minister to me, and I've gone to be good news to him. I've gone to serve and not be served. And here, in this moment, he begins to minister to me. And he says, I'm going to journey with you on this one. And we're going to be friends, and I'm going to keep praying. This is a guy who really has so little to offer as far as the world is concerned. But yet, in this moment, he begins to bless me. And then as we journey through the adoption process, he says, this is me and you, Sam. We're going to journey this through together, and I'm going to be your mate. And when you get a kid, I'm going to be their uncle. And in my family, the uncle buys the first pet. Don't let anyone else buy a pet. We buy the pet. And he loved reptiles. And I'm like, I'm not having a snake. Thankfully, we had a rabbit, and that was fine. But I remember one particular time my mate invited me round to the house, and he said, Sam, I've made something for your little girl, Willow. Willow's my little adopted girl, not so little now. And I went round, and my mate's house is really not very nice. It's a drug den in all sense of the word. There's no carpet on the floor, there's no wallpapers on the wall. They heat their house by really cutting down other people's fences and burning it. And that's a long story. And he invites me into the back room of his house, and there's something on the table, this object covered by a sheet. And he says, I've been working on this. And he pulls the sheet off. And this is an incredible doll's house. Incredible doll's house. I'm like, where did you buy this? He said, I haven't bought it. I've been making it. This is a guy who's never had a job in his life. This is a guy that has smoked, when I add it up, over £1 million worth of heroin. Imagine the criminality that he's had to do in order to be able to pay for his drug habit. But yet, his project is to bless my daughter with the most incredible doll's house. Double-fronted doors that open to multiple rooms. And every room is carpeted because he's been to the carpet shop to ask for the offcuts. And every room has been wallpapered. And he says to me, it's not quite ready, Sam. I've just got to fit the electrics. And I'm like, we don't need electrics in a doll's house. But this is my friend who says he's going to journey with me. The relational opportunities that come when I don't just see people as my mission field, when I don't just decide I've got to do everything I can just to tell them the gospel, but when I align myself with people and begin to share the best and the worst of me, deeper relationships are formed. My mate now loves the Lord. My mate now loves to study the Bible with me. We started this thing called Five Guys, 3 Blokes in a Bible. We go to Five Guys, 3 of us, and a Bible, and we just study the Word in Five Guys and watch people eat their very expensive food. But see, I'm given that opportunity to meet him and minister to him in a deeper way, because over years I've drawn alongside to the point where it's not just a relationship formed so that I can tell him the gospel, but formed so that we can be gospeling together. I met with a bunch of church leaders, and they were asking me, how do you work with addicts? How do you make sure they fit in church? How do you make them more like us? And I'm like, we're doing something wrong. See, we're journeying together to be more like Christ. I don't want to see people want to become like me. I want to see them one, and together we journey to be more and more Christ-like. And it's done as we work together in relationship. One of the first people that I met in my community was a fella called Paul. He lived next door. I got to know Paul because one particular day I was called at work because someone had spotted that we'd been burgled. And so I went home and arrived just as a policeman arrived at our house. And we went inside my house to find that everything that could be carried had gone. They'd broken the kitchen window, they'd taken everything and gone out the back door. And I said to the copper, like, what do you do now? What do we do at this point? And he said, well, you live on a small street with narrow streets and thin walls. Someone will have heard something. Let's try your neighbor's house. So we knocked on for Paul. And as we knocked, his door wasn't quite shut properly, so it opened. And I thought, oh no, they've done Paul's house too. But as we go inside Paul's house, all our belongings are stacked up in his house. The kids are back, which means I've talked too long. I'm so sorry. So we wait for Paul to come home. And it's actually not weeks, but it's months before Paul arrives back. And we have this awkward conversation where I asked him about what's going on and how all my stuff ended up in his house. And he gave us some excuse about it not being him. And we were like, sure. And so we got to know Paul a little bit better. And we learned a little more about his life, about the addictions that he was facing. And I learned actually that his body was beginning to fail. He was dying, waiting for a liver transplant. Regularly had to go in for medication and medical help in order to survive. But he wasn't getting a transplant. There was no sign of a liver coming. And so eventually the day came when an ambulance came to collect him. And he was told that if a liver wasn't found within the next few days, that he would pass from this life to the next. And I remember getting everybody I know to pray for my neighbor Paul, pray that a miracle would happen, that there'd be instant healing, or that a liver would be found and his life would be rescued. But no liver came and no miracle happened. And so we had our final visit to visit Paul. Lying very sick upon his bed, again we told him about the good news of Jesus. I told him that Jesus would be waiting for him. I told him that as he passed from this life to the next, there was a God who loved him, that a God who would forgive him and a God who would welcome him. And on his deathbed, Paul says yes to Jesus. Because as he's dying, he says, I know your words are true. And I said, how do you know, Paul? How do you know that what we say is true? He says, because I saw it living next door to me. I saw that the God you serve is loving because you loved me. I saw that your God is forgiving because you forgave me, even though I stole everything from you. I know your God is welcoming because you welcomed me into your home. Our words and our life must be aligned. You've been blessed to be a blessing. You've encountered the love of God to be loving. You've experienced the grace of God that you might show the grace of God to those around you. My question for you this morning is, do you know the good news of the gospel? Have you been exposed to it in its radical, life-changing form? Is it still making a difference to your life today? Have you been transformed by it? Can other people see how it's transforming your life? Has the gospel of peace made you a person of peace? Has the joy of salvation made you someone whose joy is made known to your community, to your friends, and to your family? And so as we finish this morning, I just want to welcome you again to experience the grace of God, the love of God, the forgiveness of God, the gospel afresh. I love how Paul writes in Romans chapter 12, verse 1, about being aware in view of the mercy of God, we lay our lives down in the service of the kingdom. In view of God's mercy, I want to give you a fresh view of the mercy of God. And if this morning you feel like you need that afresh, and you want to know the love of God afresh, and you want to be on the kingdom mission of the King, then would you stand with me as I pray for us this morning?